Want to thank everyone again for joining us today. And so today's focus is on state swaps and fish and wildlife health. And as you saw from the overview, we know that the management of fish and wildlife and diseases and links to human well-being really is this growing challenge for conservation professionals. You're already seeing the documented changes. So today, what we have are a number of speakers who are going to bring to us what is the issues surrounding One Health, wildlife disease, and how do we help incorporate that into swaps. So just some usual logistics. We're recording the session. I'll be taking some notes as well. And then if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We'll have some time at the end for a little panel discussion. And then we're going to have a breakout, and we'll come back to those later on. But hopefully to be able to help follow up on questions like what you think the barriers are to better incorporating fish and wildlife health into your swap. Are there any in particular where you think that AFWA can make a difference in helping address those barriers? And what conservation actions do you plan to include in your swap to address fish and wildlife health? So I'm particularly interested in this one because years ago, one of my jobs was to help work on the injurious wildlife rule for salamanders, along with one of our speakers, Dr. Jen Ballard. So it's good to see some familiar faces and old friends again today. If there are any questions from the group, we'll go ahead and we'll jump in. Okay. All right. First up is going to be Dr. Darby Murphy, a public health veterinarian with the service, to talk about, give us a One Health 101. So give me 1 second, Darby. Let me see if I can do this. Give me one moment.
Thanks for running my slides.
Does that actually work for you? Can you see it?
Yep, I can see it.
All right, turn it over to you.
All right, thank you. All right, well, good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you all today on One Health and how Fish and Wildlife Service can assist with integrating One Health into state wildlife action plans. As mentioned, my name is Darby Murphy, and I'm a public health veterinarian / One Health coordinator with the Fish and Wildlife Service Wildlife Health Office. And you can, next slide. And here's just a brief overview of what I'll be covering this afternoon. So next slide, please. All right, so many of you are likely familiar with the term One Health. There's really kind of two definitions: the philosophical one of how animal, human, and ecosystem health are linked and interdependent, and kind of the operational definition of how a One Health approach is actually accomplished. There are many definitions for One Health you've likely seen. The definition you see here on the slide is from the quadripartite, the One Health high-level expert panel, comprised of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the United Nations Environment Program, the World Health Organization, and the World Organization for Animal Health. So the four organizations are working together to mainstream One Health so that they're better prepared to prevent, predict, detect, and respond to global health threats and promote sustainable development. And as you can see kind of on the slide, their definition really tries to tie together the philosophical and operational definitions. Next slide, please. So how do you take a One Health approach? The image on this slide is from the quadripartite and depicts the operational definition of One Health. And you can see here that we have the integration between the sectors and the disciplines in different areas of expertise in human, animal, and environmental health, and the communication, collaboration, coordination, capacity building between society and the sectors and disciplines that go into tackling One Health issues and achieving healthy ecosystems, healthy animals, and healthy people. So One Health issues are typically very complex, longstanding issues with multiple perspectives on the cause of the issue and potential solutions to the issue. Often you're working with diverse stakeholders where it's difficult to align your efforts. People are working on different elements, often from various areas of expertise, and are focusing on different mission areas, sometimes with competing objectives. So really the last part of that OLAP definition, if you remember from the previous slide, focuses on, the operational side of how to really accomplish the One Health approach. Next slide, please. So here's a quote from the recent AFWA President's Task Force on One Health final report. The report was completed as part of the recommendation from the white paper, the AFWA and the One Health approach, providing the foundation for a leadership role, and develop a list of prioritized next steps for AFWA's leadership in the One Health space, and identify strategies for the association to collaborate more effectively with partners on issues surrounding One Health. But the term One Health may seem to be a relatively recent one for some of you, but the quote from this paper is really trying to emphasize that the concept of One Health, which may have been referred to by other names or words over time, is really not a new concept at all. Next slide, please. So we know that there are 8 required elements identified to include in comprehensive wildlife conservation plans or the state wildlife action plans. I will try to quickly go over examples of how One Health or the One Health approach can be integrated into each of the 8 elements. So for element 1, regarding information on distribution and abundance of species of wildlife, you can try to identify methods to understand both the direct and indirect impacts of disease and other health issues on wildlife species distribution and abundance, which includes identifying priority areas, species of conservation concern, and other species identified as vulnerable, establishing a database of health-related information on those identified populations, especially because some species there isn't a lot of health information out there to begin with. Identifying best methods for monitoring populations, identifying what supplies are necessary for wildlife disease surveillance and morbidity and mortality response. Trying to identify what resources, staff, and equipment that you currently have, and then trying to project what your needs will be, and also what may be maintained by partners that you work with that could be borrowed if needed in case of an emergency. Also recognizing the importance of establishing and updating on a regular basis a directory of staff knowledge, training, and skills, and maintaining a core number of staff if possible within particular areas of expertise so that your program can keep functioning as planned. For element 2, working to identify and understand potential changes to key habitats is essential. These changes can be from land use modifications, habitat loss, climate change, contamination, invasive species introduction, limited resources, changes in policies and regulations. And we know that most, if not all, ecosystems are impacted by external stressors, and that these stressors can significantly impact the distribution and density of wildlife, across populations across the landscape, and then can have an influence in turn on disease occurrence and transmission in wildlife populations. You can also consider defining management areas within it that have a history of disease outbreaks in wildlife, and further define whether they're zoonotic and identify whether there's potential risks to domestic animal health and human health as well. Next slide, please. So for element 3, working with partners to develop a protocol for monitoring for morbidity and mortality events, conducting targeted surveillance efforts, and working with others to develop and maintain strategic plans regarding surveillance and management of wildlife diseases, especially those shared between wildlife, domestic animals, and humans. You have to remember that, species don't recognize boundaries, so working with partners is really essential. You can also work with partners to design and implement surveillance strategy and diagnostic testing plans for priority pathogens identified in wildlife species in your state. And many root causes of disease processes in wildlife are rarely a completely natural process anymore, right? Not to mention the fact that disease is a very complex process, influenced by many different factors, and changes to any one or all of the elements of the disease triad, so host, agent, and the environment, can really influence disease outcomes. So it's really important to try to understand the full picture, or at least as complete of a picture as possible. Because if you're just treating the symptoms of the disease, but not really determining, what the root causes or upstream drivers or other stressors are in a population, you won't really be focusing your time, resources, energy, and on, long-term sustainable solutions. And you also have to remember that none of this is happening in a vacuum, and many management plans have long-term conservation implications. And then for element 4, based on issues identified in species of conservation concern, you want to establish goals and objectives to address priority areas and how these goals will be measured, determine if there's a need to collaborate within or outside of your agency to meet your identified goals. When capture is required for surveillance or research, consider disease risk assessments before you would translocate species if you identify that that's something that needs to be done. Having biosafety for personnel, health and safety, and then biosecurity plans in place. So you're not moving diseases or invasive species, for example, from one place to another. Are there preventive health measures that can be implemented? Do you have established disease contingency plans in case of a disease outbreak? Regular wildlife disease and emergency response trainings, or a needs assessment of what trainings will be helpful for staff in order to accomplish your goals. Next slide, please. So for element 5, consider a One Health approach to monitoring species and habitats, working with other states, tribes, international and other partners, working with partners to create management plans based on identified issues and the best available data that you have that are also flexible in order to respond to new and or emerging issues, because we know that is an ongoing thing that affects wildlife and ecosystem health. Consider working with researchers such as social scientists on understanding different methods for disease monitoring with various different partners, like, for example, citizen science programs, and developing and updating policies, guidance, and best management practices for working with wildlife. And then for element 6, working collaboratively within and outside of your agency to determine if you need to develop shorter or ongoing reviews or outcome evaluations. This can help really guide you based on gaps in knowledge that may be identified throughout the review process, or an assessment of your needs based on ongoing evaluations. So next slide, please. So element 7 focuses on plans for collaborating with stakeholders on the development, implementation, review, and revision of your SWAP. Stakeholders can include, tribal, state, federal wildlife conservation agencies, public health agencies, environmental health agencies, landowners, universities, non-governmental organizations, for example. Establishing and maintaining those partnerships and communication networks with these groups can really facilitate rapid and effective communications, improving, response time to issues that affect wildlife health, public health, and or ecosystem health. And you can also consider developing or updating preparedness and response plans and actions, and working with partners on integrating emergencies that involve wildlife health into already established incident or emergency response networks that may already be established in your state. And then for element 8, the mission of the Fish and Wildlife Service begins with the words working with others. So working with others to conserve, protect, and enhance fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for the continuing benefit of the American people. So it's really important, working with others, ensuring public participation in informing wildlife management decisions and wildlife disease surveillance and response efforts, establishing communication plans or frameworks to aid in emergency preparedness for disease events and to facilitate communications with diverse audiences, and collaborating with or hiring communication specialists or social scientists can also be helpful. And next slide, please. So the Fish and Wildlife Service can help assist in drafting voluntary One Health guidance for states for integrating One Health into their state wildlife action plans, similar to the voluntary guidance that you see listed there for states to incorporate climate adaptation into SWAPs. That's shown here on the slide. And then we can also help coordinate with the AFWA President's Task Force on One Health. Fish and Wildlife Service is helping to support this effort through several program areas, science applications in one of them, and then the Wildlife Health Office, to provide AFWA information they need on a broader scale concerning One Health. Next slide, please. And then we can also assist with assembling working groups and participate in the group, providing technical expertise depending on, the focus area of the group, provide individual assistance for questions or issues that come up, facilitate connections with state, local, tribal, and federal environmental health, agricultural health, and public health counterparts in your region. And many state, local, tribal, and international agencies are partnering on One Health initiatives, have established networks, have formal One Health offices, and you can see some examples that I have listed here on the slide. And next slide, please. All right, and then just kind of lastly, as many of you may know, through the help of Fish and Wildlife Service, we were able to establish the 5 AFWA regional Fish and Wildlife Health Coordinator positions, or the mini AFWAs, funded for 3 years. I think you'll be learning more about these positions this afternoon, but I just wanted to put the plug in there that the regional coordinators are also a resource that you can reach out to for assistance. And next slide. So just wrapping up here, and there's my email if you have any questions or would like to reach out. I'm happy to help.
Thank you, Darby.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're going to go ahead and move on to our next speaker. This is going to be Mark Humpert, Director of Conservation Initiatives, as you know, for AFWA. Mark, I don't think I have a presentation for you. And yes, I see the comment. We will go ahead and we're going to, I have the PowerPoints and I'll send those out with the notes as well.
Great, thanks, Jason. So I don't have any slides to show. I just wanted to spend a few minutes to remind everyone, and I know Darby mentioned the President's Task Force on One Health that AFWA stood up last year. AFWA has been involved in discussions about One Health for about 15 years. Up until the pandemic, a lot of times domestic animal health sort of took precedence in some of the One Health meetings that AFWA was involved in. Wildlife was, not maybe seen quite as critical to domestic and pet health, but that, certainly changed during the pandemic. Greater recognition of, the interface of wildlife with the environment and people health. And so Shane Mahoney, some of you may know, or have at least seen Shane speak, gave really an impassioned talk to the AFWA Executive Committee about 2 years ago, and really implored them to think about their role in One Health and, consider, kind of taking the reins and being a leader within the Fish and Wildlife Health sector. And so the AFWA Executive Committee asked Shane to write a white paper that sort of laid out that argument. And then that led to a President's Task Force on One Health that was led by Paul Johansson, Director of West Virginia, and Amanda Wustefeld, Director in Indiana. And they pulled together a diverse group and sort of broke into 4 subgroups: legislative, policy and governance, coordination, collaboration and engagement, training, and science and indigenous knowledge. And these 4 work groups then developed a series of strategies that would help AFWA sort of take a more prominent role in One Health discussions. And so I'm going to pop the final report from the President's Task Force. It was approved at the AFWA annual meeting in September. If you want to look at that, and it has some nice background, has the recommendations, but sort of the next step for implementing the recommendations is for AFWA to stand up a One Health committee. We already have a really active Fish and Wildlife Health Committee that does great work. AFWA is one of the conveners of the Fish and Wildlife Health Initiative, which does great work, but it was really felt like there needs to be a separate space for One Health. So Ron Reagan and AFWA Executive Director and Chuck Sykes, AFWA President, are working on identifying a chair for the One Health Committee, and pending finding a chair and a vice chair and developing a charge. That committee would likely meet for the first time at the North American next March to really start to put in gear some of the strategies that were developed out of this President's Task Force. So I'll leave it there, but there's probably some things in that report that might help you with your state wildlife action plan. Certainly, I heard loud and clear from Darby that she and the Fish and Wildlife Service are more than willing to help. It's big, it's complicated, it's hard. So if you're a SWAP coordinator working on revising your state wildlife action plan, take care of these resources, take advantage of these resources that you have that really help with One Health and Fish and Wildlife Health.
Thank you, Mark. So next up, we're going to have an overview of key fish and wildlife health issues to consider for your SWAP. And presenting that is going to be an old friend, Dr. Jen Ballard, who's the state wildlife veterinarian and assistant chief for the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission. So Jen, give me 1 second to share this screen. If I can figure out which one it is, here we go. Okay. And hopefully you see it, and just let me know when you want me to move screens.
I think that's the PDF. I sent you a PowerPoint as well.
Oh.
It might work better in the PowerPoint.
Don't have the PowerPoint.
Okay. We can work with this. So, as Jason mentioned, my name is Dr. Jen Ballard. I am the state wildlife veterinarian with the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission. My role in the agency is to help fish and wildlife managers incorporate concepts of health into their research and management plans. So, what I want to do today is just go through some really basic concepts and share some overarching ideas about the relationship between health and fish and wildlife management, and how you can incorporate that into your state wildlife action plans. So specifically, I would like to define health and then discuss some ways that we measure health. And how you can incorporate that. And although I'm going to make the point largely that health is much broader than just disease, I want to circle back to disease near the end and talk about a specific lens that you can look at disease through in terms of conservation. And then lastly, I want to tie the relationship between wildlife health and One Health that we just discussed back into together to discuss how those work together. So I'm going to reference a paper by the fabulous Craig Stephen from 2014 toward a modernized definition of wildlife health. And I'm happy to share the full manuscript with anyone who would like to see it. But I think that this paper is very short and it just really encapsulates this idea of what health is and how it can be applied to wildlife. And first and foremost, he makes the absolute point that we cannot define health as the absence of disease, or conversely, the presence of disease and the lack of health. Health is a much, much broader concept than disease, and a freedom from disease is not a plausible standard for measuring health. He also points out that by its very nature, disease response as our sole mission is a fundamentally reactive process, whereas managing for health is a fundamentally proactive process. And in general, I think we'd all prefer to be proactive rather than reactive in our work. He also points out that basically health is an illusion. That's probably not what you expected me to say today, that health isn't real, but the concept of health is a dynamic human construct. What in reality we have is, next slide. What we have in reality is a spectrum. We have a dynamic spectrum of animals and populations in a range of physiologic conditions. And when we determine that something is either healthy or unhealthy, we basically set an arbitrary threshold of what is acceptable. That's going to depend on our training. It's going to depend on our perspectives. And in many ways, a lot of the influences that have us influence the way we value wildlife and the things that we fear in many ways. There's going to be a lot that goes into what we consider an appropriate threshold. So what I would encourage is just let's think about that's okay, that it's kind of an illusion, that it's a dynamic human construct, as long as we keep that in mind and select thresholds that are in fact biologically relevant. Finally, in that manuscript, Craig Stephen proposes that health is ultimately a result of interacting biological, social, and environmental determinants that promote and maintain health as a capacity to cope with change over time. Summary: health is resilience, and resilience is health. And while health may feel like a new concept or a new thing that we're entering into our conservation framework, resilience, I think, is an old friend. It's very familiar and something we've been striving for a long time. So in reality, in many ways, we've been doing this for a very, very long time. So if health is hard to measure, resilience may be almost impossible. So if anything, health and resilience are both highly multifactorial. So as we think about how we can measure health, there will never be just one single measurement that we can ever take that will determine health, or that we can say it is or isn't a healthy population, we measured this. We're always going to need to lean into probably multiple measurements and realize that what we are studying either is something that will directly influence health or it will be a reflection of health. So the things that can influence health: resource availability, habitat, food availability, water availability, diet, all of the normal things that we think of when we look at conserving populations. Because there is a social element, it also can include population structure and density and other factors like that. Sources of stress, whether that's competition, light or sound pollution, proximity to other anthropogenic factors, but sources of stress can influence health. Genetics, we often think of genetics in the conservation of species of greatest conservation need. Do we have sufficient diversity to maintain a stable population? But genetics then also plays into individual and population level health. And then at the bottom of the list, and that is with great intention, yes, we have the old standbys of toxin exposures, pathogen or parasite exposures. They can influence health, but if anything, I want to leave the impression that health is much, much more than just these factors. And then if we're going to measure those, we might be able to measure some of those directly, but we can also anticipate the impact that they will have on our resources, and we can measure factors that reflect the health. So sort of a cause or effect. And that may include anything from just looking at body condition, organ function, immune responses, either the presence of inflammation, the presence of antibodies, or conversely, immunosuppression. We may look for active infections that are ongoing, parasite loads that may themselves be problematic or may actually be reflective of other issues in the population. Reproduction and ultimately causes of mortality can all reflect the overall health of the population and may, in different combinations, be great ways to measure this idea of health as resilience. Sorry, this one was the one slide that would have been better in the PowerPoint. I apologize, but the idea that I was going for here is that when we go to apply this, we have a series of steps. And the first step would be to identify the species and populations of interest. Now, the great news is if you're incorporating this into your SWOP, you've already done this. Congratulations, step one. So your species of greatest conservation need are inherently going to be the species of interest when we look at incorporating health into our SWOPs. Then the next step would be to critically evaluate the potential threats to those populations, which largely you're already doing. That is, a key component of the state wildlife action plans already. But what this might entail with respect to health is broadening the number or the range of threats that we consider and really thinking through a different lens of what other threats may be present, either in the presence of introduced pathogens or sources of stress or other physiologic compromise. After we've identified those threats, we can think specifically about what the outcomes of those threats would look like, how they would manifest in terms of wildlife health and resilience. And then we can think about ways to measure those predicted health outcomes. So this sounds really rudimentary and basic, but the thing that I want to really emphasize is that doing wildlife health does not have to be a fishing trip. It doesn't have to be about going out there and just surveying for every possible pathogen or every possible disease. I work in a state agency just like you guys, and I know that we are very, very resource limited. And so I think one of the biggest barriers we have is this implication that wildlife health means more work. So if anything, I would just want to emphasize that let's be very strategic about how we implement this. Let's think about what the most likely significant issues are, and let's be very specific in how we measure those. So in terms of your upcoming SWOP revisions, you'll already have the species identified. You may think about broadening the scope of threats that you consider, and you don't have to do these next two steps right away, but those might be great subjects for knowledge gaps or research priorities over the following 10 years that will be reflected in your wildlife action plan. Next slide. But I would encourage you don't just measure the problems. Also think about the opportunities to measure our success, our conservation successes in the form of metrics of health. So if we have restored and compromised populations, we can compare their health. Or if we're doing restoration efforts, we can look at before and after effects of the health of those populations and demonstrate not just the number that are there or the diversity that's there, but also the overall health. And I think that if we start to do this, which is to date, I think pretty rare, if we start to think about these as metrics of success, we can probably find opportunities to show that we've not just restored habitats and hoped that species become more resilient, but that we've actually actively improved their health. So think of opportunities to use metrics of health as measures of conservation success. Next slide. But what about pathogens? I've tried to emphasize that health and disease, it's a lot more than just disease and pathogens, but still pathogens are sort of this black box. We kind of come back to it. It's the thing that feels daunting. It may be the thing that's least familiar in our conservation planning. So I want to give you a lens to think about pathogens through. Next slide. This is the disease triad, and nothing in the framework of disease management makes sense outside of the context of the triad, because disease is not an inherent outcome of a pathogen simply being present. For disease to occur, you have to have a susceptible host, a viable pathogen able to cause disease, and you have to have an environment that brings them together in a certain way. And so just measuring the presence or absence of pathogens really underestimates, and it takes a really myopic view of this bigger ecological picture. And then if we come to a place where we figure out that we need to manage a disease, we can look at these interactions, and it's usually by affecting one of these three things, either the host, the environment, or the pathogen itself, that we can break cycles of transmission and effectively manage disease. Next slide. I like to think of pathogens in conservation as basically falling into one of three categories. There's a lot of pathogens in our wildlife populations that, for the context of conservation, are essentially neutral. They don't cause overt disease in our wildlife populations. They're not causing any kind of decline or contributing really substantially to the conservation of species. And we need to know when a pathogen is kind of neutral in our populations, and we can set it aside and look at other issues. That's not to say that studying these never has value. Sometimes these are the pathogens that have greater implications for public health or for livestock health in a One Health framework. So there are going to be times that it's appropriate to examine these relatively neutral pathogens, but as state conservation agencies, those may not be our top priorities. But it's also important to keep in mind that those neutral pathogens can move into the second category and become opportunistic pathogens. This can result from changes in the host or the environment that change that whole dynamic that I talked about in the disease triad, so that diseases emerge to increase mortality, decrease reproduction. It's kind of the death by 1,000 cuts, or the camel and the straw sort of analogy. But it's really important when we start to see diseases emerging to ask ourselves, is this opportunistic or is this primary? Because if it's an opportunistic disease emergence, addressing the disease is just going to be a band-aid. We need to figure out what the underlying ecological drivers are and address those, and then the disease will basically take care of itself. But unfortunately, in recent years, I think we've come to learn really that there is a category of diseases that are primary threats to conservation, diseases that have the potential to drive population declines and even extinctions. And when we have those, that's when we sort of turn our focus and really have to address those much more directly. And there are some ecological characteristics that can predispose certain pathogens to being primary conservation threats, including frequency-dependent disease transmission, being able to infect multiple hosts, whether those are other wildlife species or livestock, the formation of environmental reservoirs, and diseases that negatively affect reproduction and recruitment. So when we look at new and emerging pathogens, we can ask ourselves which of these characteristics they have, or is it maybe more likely to be in the opportunistic category than a primary conservation threat? But I think when we consider things like chytrid fungus and white nose syndrome and even chronic wasting disease, we start to see a lot of these ecological characteristics in pathogens that are already causing significant conservation issues. Next slide. So in conclusion, I really want to I've kind of focused on fish and wildlife health and hopefully given you some practical tips for incorporating and considering this in your SWAP revisions. But thinking back to the bigger picture of One Health, I think that one of the things I hear a lot from my colleagues in the state agencies is that One Health feels like it's going to be more work. It's going to be new work. It's this whole one more thing to address. And if I could emphasize anything with regard to the relationship between wildlife health and One Health, it's that you're already doing One Health. It doesn't necessarily have to be more work, because what the One Health framework does is it takes the things that you're already doing to conserve wildlife and to improve wildlife health, fish and wildlife health, or to improve ecosystems. Those already have collateral benefits for public health and for environmental health and for livestock health and all of those other factors in the One Health framework. What you do is already One Health. So what's the benefit of tying it back to One Health? I think what it comes down to is we can take what are basically collateral benefits to the work that we already do, and we can present them to the public just as benefits, not collateral, just benefits. We can add relevance to the work that we do. People who maybe aren't terribly invested in our wildlife trust resources may find relevance in our work if they understand the benefits to our food chain or to improving public health. And so by changing the angle that we present our work from and using a One Health angle, we can give ourselves and our existing work new relevance. And with relevance, I believe, comes relationships, opportunities for non-traditional partnerships that we will benefit conservation by showing people the benefit to them through this new lens. And hopefully with increased relevance and increased relationships will come new resources to continue our conservation missions. And, you know, we all need new resources. So I think we can all agree that that's a good thing. And with that, I guess we'll hold questions till the end.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we'll come back. All right. Thanks, Doc. Okay, our next speakers, strategies for addressing wildlife health issues in the Pennsylvania Wildlife Action Plan. So we're going to turn it over to Dr. Andrew DeSalvo. I apologize if I mangled your name. Dr. Julie Ellis. Dr. DeSalvo is from the Pennsylvania Game Commission. Dr. Julie Ellis from the University of Pennsylvania, Penn Vet Wildlife Futures Program. And you want me to run your presentation too, right?
Yes, please, Jason. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Just give me 1 second to load it up here. Okay. And hopefully you see that and should be good to go.
Dr. DeSalvo, you teeing us off here?
I am. Sorry, I was talking with my mic muted. Thanks, Jason and Julie. So I'm Dr. Andrew DeSalvo. I'm with the Pennsylvania Game Commission. I've been out here for 4 years. Just wanted to kind of set the stage, or Jen set the stage very nicely for us. And then we wanted to kind of go into some particulars about what we're doing in Pennsylvania with the hope that potentially this can spurn some ideas that you could apply at any scale, really, in your state, just the way we're thinking about it and the way we're moving forward with it. So I just wanted to point out that the Wildlife Action Plan in Pennsylvania, we're Pennsylvania, so we have to be unique, is actually managed by 2 different agencies. That's the Game Commission, as well as the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission. So the Game Commission's responsible for just wild birds and wild mammals, while the Fish and Boat Commission are responsible for freshwater freshwater mussels, fish, amphibians, reptiles, everything else. So they kind of split it across 2 agencies, but Kathy Hafner is our representative in that regard. And then Diana Day is the Fish and Boat representative. So that's all the folks on this, as well as some examples of some of our SGCNs here in Pennsylvania. Next slide, please. So just to give you all an idea of what we are in Pennsylvania very fortunate to have, and that's the Pennsylvania University of Pennsylvania Penn Vet Wildlife Futures Program. So this kicked off just over 4 years ago, and it's just a partnership between Penn Vet and the Pennsylvania Game Commission, really aiming at making our wildlife health program and just our wildlife health knowledge, diagnostic capabilities much more robust for the future. We have 480 species of birds and mammals that we're responsible for. I think 414 of those are birds and the other 66 are mammals. And so it's a lot to consider. And you'll see we're able to perhaps address this wildlife health issue in a much more comprehensive way than we have been able to in the past. So we're very fortunate to have this collaboration. Next slide, please. So to give a little bit of an idea of kind of where we came from, and the last iteration of the Pennsylvania Wildlife Action Plan was done prior to my arrival in Pennsylvania, but I've come to learn that it was not very robust in terms of wildlife health. It only was a few pages through no fault of anyone's. It was just a matter of capabilities. And at the time, there was limited capacity. There was not the Wildlife Futures Program. There was a single wildlife veterinarian, Justin Brown, in the position when the plan was developed. And the approach was a little bit simple in that it was asking for, let's summarize some known diseases that we can address directly. And it focused on white nose syndrome and chytrid fungus, at least for the Game Commission's species responsibilities, as well as those other 2 diseases, rhinovirus and fungal dermatitis, for fish and boat species that were threatened by that. So if you could hit the next slide, I think we have a screenshot of kind of our approach for white nose syndrome and the little brown bat, and kind of how we addressed it in that last iteration of the Wildlife Action Plan. So as I mentioned, it's only really incorporated about 2.5 total pages. What we want to do in the future, and Julie will get into these details, is to not only address what we currently know, but also look out on the horizon and think about what are some emerging or potentially emerging threats to wildlife health in our state. And then how we can prepare. How can we boost our surveillance, our monitoring, preparedness, whether it's developing management plans, moving forward. So we're hopeful that this more robust approach that Julie will get into over the next 6 slides will lead us to have a much more accurate accounting of really wildlife health components when it comes to SGCNs. And it's a challenge. Jen mentioned how multifactorial it is. We are, I will say, primarily focused on the pathogen side of things, but understanding, of course, that there are things to consider like climate change and other things in the One Health sphere that definitely impact resilience, wildlife health, if you will. So next slide, please. All right, I think Julie is going to take over from here.
Thanks, Andrew. I also wanted to acknowledge that Diana Day is here, and she's with the Fish and Boat Commission, and she's going to be working with us closely on this. So thank you, Diana. Kathy Hafner couldn't make it today, but she's also fabulous to work with. And, you know, we'll be leaning on them a lot for their expertise on the state wildlife action plans. And then also I wanted to give a shout out to Scott Larson, who's our wildlife veterinary liaison here at the Futures Program. He and I are working as the leads for the Wildlife Futures Program on this project today. So I may be calling upon him as well during my presentation. So I see we're a little short on time, so I'm going to try to go through this in a timely fashion. So essentially what we are doing in collaboration with Game Commission and Fish and Boat is what I'm going to describe as essentially a statement of work. So we're calling it Integrating Wildlife Health Priorities into the 2025-2035 Pennsylvania Wildlife Action Plan. And we have three major objectives. One is to identify the priority health threats to terrestrial and aquatic Pennsylvania SGCN over the next decade, noting threats that may be exacerbated with changing climatic conditions. And Jason, sorry, I've got like animated things in here. Thank you. And then second major objective is to determine passive and active wildlife health surveillance priorities for the Pennsylvania WAP based on those identified health threats. And these surveillance priorities would really, we would want them to inform our own wildlife health surveillance plans that we've developed jointly with Game Commission. We as in Wildlife Futures. So we're going to use that information to determine like where we should be focusing our surveillance priorities in the next, 5 to 10 years. And then we're also hoping that these would help to inform development of Fish and Boat Commission surveillance plan for their jurisdictional species as well. And then next objective is to present population and habitat management strategies that may mitigate species impacts and geographic spread of priority threats after they are detected in Pennsylvania. Okay, next slide. So what I wanted to do, and I'm really glad Jen came before us, because I very much appreciated your presentation. We really talked back and forth a little bit about what is the scope of work here? Like, what are we talking about when we refer to health? And also sort of what's feasible to tackle in the state wildlife action plans. So what we are using, and this will apply to our surveys and our literature searches that we will do, is we are defining the scope of work to be health threats. So we're looking to identify current health threat priorities, but also potential health threats. And those health threats would include organisms, so viruses, fungi, things that you typically think of as pathogens, toxins, those are toxic substances produced by organisms, chemical pollutants that could include heavy metals, pesticides, and all of these can cause diseases in wildlife. But we also acknowledge that with climate change, you could have additional exposures to extreme weather events and heat, both caused by climate change, and that those threats for the Pennsylvania WAP, generally like overarching climate change threats, will be addressed separately. But for the health section, we're going to note where there are observed climatic changes like increased average temperatures, and consider those for wildlife health where they're documented. So a good example of that would be West Nile virus contributing to ruffed grouse declines, and that being impacted by changes in temperature, average temperatures. Okay, next slide. So the approach that we're taking to this project is to first identify and convene working and advisory groups. So we've developed a Wildlife Futures working group, and we'll be the primary contributors and sort of the workhorses for this health risk assessment. And then we will reach out to content experts as well, that to kind of round out what kind of taxonomic and health threat expertise we might not currently have on the team. And so that is the function of the working group. And then we're also going to form an advisory group, and I'll go into a little bit more detail about the composition of that in a couple of slides. And the second step in our approach is to develop a survey and then distribute that survey to state agencies, wildlife health programs, and other relevant groups in the region. And we're doing that in coordination with Melanie Kunkel, who is the Northeast Wildlife Health Coordinator. I think her name was listed in this symposium. But the goals of this survey will be to identify health threats outside of Pennsylvania that could impact Pennsylvania SGCN, and evaluate the effectiveness of management actions that are either planned or already in use by other states to address these threats. And then particularly thinking about those, in addition, that may be intensified by climate change. Third, so we'll do the survey, and then in addition to that and concurrently with that, we're going to conduct a literature review to summarize information on highest priority health threats and their risks to SGCN in particular. And these reviews we're structuring right now how we're going to do them to make sure that they're robust and standardized, and they'll be organized most likely by species or species groups and by health threats. And then this regional survey results in combination with the literature review will be condensed into a comprehensive summary. And that kind of larger summary will be used as the basis for drafting a wildlife health section for the Pennsylvania WAP. So the summary will probably be too lengthy to include in its entirety. So we're going to prepare a final synthesis that's more appropriate in length and content, and really focuses on priority threats and then information gaps to identify strategies for surveillance and unmet research needs. And then management strategies will also be noted in that synthesis. And then that will be taken into drafting the wildlife health section for the Pennsylvania WAP. And then just real briefly, what we've done so far, we relatively recently started this process. And so we're trying to get this up and running as quickly as we can. And so we have a working group identified. Our working group is primarily the Wildlife Futures personnel. We're also going to be enlisting within our personnel, we have some postdocs and then veterinary students that we will be enlisting in, particularly in the literature search. And that working group is going to meet monthly to ensure that we're staying on track. And then our advisory group will be composed of Game Commission personnel, Fish and Boat Commission, Melanie Kunkel, the Neafwa Wildlife Health Coordinator. And then fortuitously, I did happen to reach out to Sam Gibbs at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who put me in touch with Darby. So we're hoping that Darby's office will also participate in our advisory group to give us sort of a more broad national perspective on things we should be thinking about in Pennsylvania. Okay, next slide. Thank you. We are nearly done with a final draft of our survey. We've been going back and forth with Mel a little bit on this. What are the best questions to ask for this kind of survey? And crafting the survey so we get information that we can really use and leverage for our approach. And then our idea also is to share those survey results with all the participants in the survey so that we're not the only ones benefiting from that information that comes out of this. And then as an add-on to this, Mal and I have proposed a health symposium at the Neafwa conference on SGCN species and health threats to those species, trying to pull in experts in all sorts of areas related to SGCN. So again, the idea being, let's try to pull people together, condense all this information and make it as useful as possible to as many other folks working on their swaps as we can. And then the last slide. And then literature review being part of this analysis and one of the deliverables of this. We really want to do this well. So, what are our search criteria? Will those search criteria change slightly depending on what taxonomic group we're dealing with? Are we searching at the level of species, or are we searching at the level of families for some of these health threats? So that's the kind of thing we're working on right now, is putting together a rigorous search criteria. What databases are we going to use? What are our inclusions and exclusions? And then ensuring that we're all using the same reference software and saving the searches and, documenting the search so that for the next swap down the road, they can go back and, say, well, we know this is how things were searched for this time around. So we don't have to duplicate that. We can just, add on with the next decade worth of literature for that. And that's it for me.
Okay.
That's it. Thank you so much, Jason.
Hey, thank you. So I just want to I'm doing a quick check on time. We have 2 more presentations, a little bit shorter. We do want to leave some time for a Q&A. So what I'm going to suggest, unless Mark disagrees, is that we'll just cut into some of the breakout time for that. We'll still leave some of that, but I'm just thinking we want to make sure we have some room here. Mark, is
Yeah,
that all right?
these are really rich presentations, so I think we should just continue with the presentations, and if we get cut short on the breakout groups, we'll find another time to, maybe we'll do that up maybe next month.
Okay, but in the meantime, yeah, if you have questions, please make sure we put them in the chat. So the next speaker is going to talk about Regional Fish and Wildlife Association health coordinators, who they are and what they do. And that's going to be Dr. Ellen Haynes from the Southeast Fish and Wild, who's the Southeast Fish and Wildlife Health Coordinator. And Dr. Haynes, you want me to call up your presentation?
Sure, that'd be great. Thank you.
Okay, give me 1 second. All right. Take it away.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for the invitation to be here today to introduce myself and the other regional fish and wildlife health coordinators. As Jason mentioned, my name is Ellen Haynes, and I'm the Southeastern regional coordinator. Next slide, please. Sorry, I just tried to advance it on my own.
Sorry about that.
No worries. Thank you. So just a quick introduction. I think many folks on this call will already have met us. We've been in our positions for between 5 and 18 months now. So some of us are a little more settled in than others. But these are 5 positions that were funded through U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service with funding from the American Rescue Plan Act. So this funding came through Fish and Wildlife Service and then was distributed to the 4 regional regional associations of fish and wildlife agencies, as well as the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society. And so for the Southeastern Association, Fish and Wildlife Agencies, SIFWA, that's the position I'm in. And in that position, I'm stationed at SCWDS at the Southeastern Cooperative Wildlife Disease Study. So that's a really great place to be in this position with a lot of great folks to work with there. As a couple of people mentioned now, Melanie Kunkel is the Northeastern Regional Coordinator. So she's at Cornell. Tricia Fry is the Midwest Coordinator. And Justice Allen is filling in as the Western Regional Coordinator while they, I think they're in the process of interviewing folks now to fill that position. So she's just filling in for now, but there will be somebody else permanently in that position, hopefully soon. And then for the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society, Talani Francisco is the coordinator there. So each of us represents either a different region or the tribal nations. And then we're sort of collaborating with on the national level, Sonia Christensen, who's the AFWA Fish and Wildlife Health Coordinator. So we all are kind of mini Sonias. And so when these positions were created, there's a number of objectives that were set up for these positions, which are intentionally a little bit vague, but just sort of put forth what we should be working on. So I'm just going to go through those quickly. It's going to be a lot of text. I apologize on this slide. So the first objective is to serve as primary points of contact for each of the regional fish and wildlife associations on matters relating to fish and wildlife health issues. So both within the association as well as members of the association. The second objective is to support the work of the Regional Fish and Wildlife Association's Fish and Wildlife Health Committees or working groups through staffing and coordination of meetings, agenda development, collaborative cross-committee issues, and initiatives. So each of the regional associations is sort of in a different point with having these fish and wildlife health committees. In the Southeast, we have a working group that just became an official committee. The Western region and Midwest have really well-established wildlife health committees, and the Northeast is kind of working on putting that together with Melanie's ongoing efforts. So we support those committees in our different regions. So go ahead. The third objective is to work with and serve as primary points of contact for AFWA's Fish and Wildlife Health Coordinator. So as I mentioned, that's Sonia Christensen. She does that position on a part-time basis, but she's been incredibly supportive of us in our regional positions. And we work with her to support AFWA's National Fish and Wildlife Health Initiative, as well as to help inform critical fish and wildlife health management decisions, policies, and actions. Next bullet, please. The fourth objective is to improve communications and collaborations among all partners to address emerging fish and wildlife health issues more effectively. Go ahead. Fifth objective is to build effective relationships with state, provincial, federal, regional, tribal, territorial, and university fish and wildlife health programs within our regions to identify and prioritize short-term and long-term needs and resources related to wildlife disease management, surveillance, education, communication, training, and research. So that's a mouthful there, but basically, we want to be coordinating on a regional and even on a multi-regional level with all possible partners so that we can advance wildlife health, really. Next. The next objective is to work closely with state fish and wildlife health programs within our regions to assist with and coordinate the identification, planning, writing, and submission of multi-agency grant applications for fish and wildlife health funding. Go ahead. And then finally, to identify the fish and wildlife health needs of the individual state fish and wildlife agencies within our regions. For example, looking at availability of diagnostic lab support, the availability of skilled personnel and training needs, looking at outstanding research questions to improve disease management, and then to develop strategies to meet those needs. So looking at all of these objectives, it's really clear that we have the opportunity to be a resource for the revision of the state wildlife action plans. So they kind of fit into a multitude of these objectives. Next slide, please. And so I just kind of wanted to summarize what we've been doing so far. As I mentioned, we've been in our positions for anywhere from 5 months to 1.5 years. So, but we work together a lot, we communicate a lot, and we have monthly meetings on Zoom. Unfortunately, we can't be in person all the time to discuss regional issues and opportunities for multi-regional collaboration. So that's discussing things between the regional coordinators, as well as with Sonia Christensen, who's a great resource for connecting us to sort of national level issues. Go ahead. We've been involved with creating an updated toolkit for the National Fish and Wildlife Health Initiative. Hopefully most of you are aware that initiative it was created by the AFWA Fish and Wildlife Health Committee. That initiative has a steering committee, and there was a toolkit created years ago with the intention of enabling various state, tribal, provincial wildlife agencies to set up and improve their fish and wildlife health programs. And so that toolkit, we're just dusting it off and creating a document as well as a resource repository that will be to serve that same purpose, just a little more updated. Next. We've also been involved in coordinating ongoing SARS-CoV-2 testing in white-tailed deer. That's through USDA APHIS. Go ahead. And we, as I mentioned, kind of in the previous slide, we're all at different stages in creating or supporting our regional wildlife health technical committees. Go ahead. I should not have put this much animation in here.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead. And then, on an as-needed basis, we help with wildlife health consulting for state agencies. So that's just letting states know that we're here for you. Should you have questions about, mortality events or management strategies. So the state wildlife health, state wildlife action plans fit perfectly into that activity. Next one. And I kind of mentioned building state wildlife agency capacity through training and grant writing. I know many of us have gone out and done trainings for individual agencies. Many of us have also been involved in writing grants to help with various state and regional research projects. Go ahead. Okay, so that's just kind of who we are. We wear a lot of different hats. We have our fingers in a lot of different pots, but we're here to help the states. We're here to help connect the states with national partners, university partners, academic partners. And so please reach out to us. If you don't already know your regional coordinator, please reach out to them. Here's our contact information, and please let us know how we can help. We're here for you.
Thanks, Ellen. And I promise I will go ahead and I'll make sure that you all have these presentations afterwards, so you have all that contact info. So last, but certainly not least, I don't know if she's still with us. Carrie, are you here? Okay. Carrie may have stepped away. So I'm going to, Carrie Wickstead, who I think many of you know is the Invasives and Reptile and Amphibian Coordinator, asked if we could just share a couple of slides. So I just want to give a quick pitch for two of her projects, or for one of, from her work related to Wildlife House. So give me 1 second. And this is going to be brief. Or it would be if I could figure out how to do the slides. Okay. All right. Well, I'm just going to read directly off of, I'm sorry?
I'm here
Oh,
actually.
you are. Oh, I'm sorry. Hey, Carrie.
I didn't realize you were calling me. So I had sent those in, but I wasn't sure if I could make it today.
Yeah, if you want to go ahead and take it, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure, thank you. And I appreciate the time just to bring up one kind of fish and wildlife health issue that's sort of on the horizon, and we have we're in a unique position to be proactive about its management versus reactive. And so for those of you who might not know, Beesol is a chytrid fungus that has not been detected in North America yet. And Beesol is short for the scientific name, the Batrachytrium salamandervorans, and I know I butchered that. But essentially, this fungus is really, really concerning for North America, given its high diversity of salamanders that are present here. So North America actually has the highest global diversity of salamanders in the world. So particularly in the southern Appalachian region. And so Beesol is a parthenogenic chytrid fungus that infects amphibians and it attacks the skin, and it's often fatal. So salamanders and newts are believed to be the most susceptible, but recent studies looking at susceptibility has also shown species like anurans, like Cuban tree frogs, can also carry and succumb to the virus. So you can see some of the stats from lab tests there. They tested 55 North American amphibian species, and 3/4 of them became infected with Beesol, and 35% developed the disease risk. So many of them were the salamanders and the newts, but certainly there were some other species like spadefoot toads and other species that were also on that list. So there's been a large effort to build understanding of species susceptibility through these lab-based experiments, and also understand the risks to different regions. And so you can see this regional risk map that was put together by Dan Greer et al. At USGS, and you can see those highest risk areas in that Appalachian region, but also along the California coast as well. So the important take home with all of this is that multiple North American species are likely at risk and can be infected and affected negatively by the pathogen. But the other thing is that we've been preparing for Beesol introduction for the last 10 years, and that can actually facilitate proactive risk management and planning. Next slide, please. So for those of you who might not be familiar with the Partners of Amphibian Reptile Conservation, we work closely with the North American Beesol Task Force, and PARC is made up of state and federal partners and folks with research institutions and zoos and aquaria and all of that. And so we have a number of resources within the PARC network, and then with our partners with the North American Beesol Task Force that might be of interest to you all. So, you know, there was last December, we had a Beesol Basics webinar that is linked on that QR code. We have a lot of current research that's happening. We're working with some of the folks who have been looking at those susceptibility studies, but also how to manage Beesol on the landscape and learning about how to use fungicides and things like that, like plant-derived fungicides, and looking at those impacts now before we have our first introduction and all of that. So in 2016, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service listed a number of salamander species under an injurious species rule for the salamander rule. It's an interim rule. It's going to be finalized this calendar year, early in 2024. And because of that susceptibility study, there's also going to be a new interim rule that's going to be introduced that's going to include some more of those species. And this is essentially to reduce the amount of trade coming into the United States of some of these salamander and newt species, because Beesol, I forgot to mention, it's over in Europe and Asia. And so part of that rule was to reduce some of that influx of those species that could have that potential infection. So the North American B-cell Task Force has a rapid response plan template on the website. They have a lot of other resources up on their website, including diagnostics labs and resources and all of that. And so, you know, we try to produce as many resources as possible to make it helpful for states to essentially prepare for this disease before it gets introduced. So that QR code links to a number of resources, so you can check that out. And if you have any questions or you want to learn more about the task force or ways to get involved, you can feel free to reach out to me. So thank you.
Thanks, Carrie. All right. So want to thank again all of our speakers for all of your presentations. We've got some time. Does anyone have a question? I'm going to take a look here at the messages and see. Or Mark, did you see any?
I think the question about PowerPoints, we'll share those. I want to just compliment our speakers. Just a great job. I'm so thrilled for that we were able to have you on today, and makes me really pleased to know that we've got some experts that are really helping provide services to the State Wildlife Action Plan programs. It's an overwhelming task to try to do a biodiversity plan for your state, and to know many of you are out there as resources. It's really great.
Well, so I do see one question. This is from Kim. This one's for Julie. Are you able to share your survey questions once you finalize them? Also, Montana has submitted a grant to do a similar disease literature review process. Can you please, I'll share your email, so I'll put that in the thing as well.
Perfect. Yes, that would be great. We're happy to share what we're doing.
I see.
And Kim, your hand is up.
Yeah, I do have a follow-up question. Could you guys hear me okay?
Mhm.
Yeah, so we submitted a grant to the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center to do a climate disease, we're calling it an assessment, where we kind of consider all of the different diseases in Montana. And I guess I'm curious, it's a pretty competitive source, so I was just curious to ask the group if there's other funding sources that you recommend. Essentially, we have the team to do it, but we don't have the capacity to do it in-house. So we're working with USGS in order to do it. So yeah, I guess I was curious, Julie, if you guys have internal funding to do that, and then just to the group, if you know of any other funding sources for us to try to get.
We don't actually have funding specific to this PA-WAP project. It's more that we're kind of leveraging, you know, the staff we currently have in place with the Wildlife Futures program to work on it, and then the vet students. So actually, I will say the vet students are not terribly expensive. And we have a little bit of foundation funding for Wildlife Futures that we could use for student stipends. So we're just paying them an hourly rate to help us with the literature searches, but otherwise leveraging, you know, existing people. Scott or Andrew, do you want to embellish on that at all, or thoughts on that?
No, I think you mentioning vet students, I think is really appropriate, because I think, I mean, many of us on this call have been there, but any opportunity to get involved in a wildlife health project, or just a wildlife project, even if it is seemingly boring, doing a lit review, if it's paid, is very attractive to a vet student. And so I think if there's an opportunity for you to build a relationship with a university that has a vet school, and you can kind of leverage that could do a lot of, you know, for lack of a better word, some of this busy background work that has to be done to kind of lay a foundation before you dive into more of the particulars. So I don't know if that's a possibility. I know there's not a vet school in Montana, so I know that's a challenge. But yeah, I know we're fortunate to have our relationship with Wildlife Futures. I know those in New York are fortunate to have the Cornell Wildlife Health Lab, and so there's little pockets here and there of generally state-specific spots. So I don't know if the answer to that is kind of was alluded to in some of these later presentations of working with one of the coordinators instead, but those are kind of some recommendations I would have for at least for maybe some of the busier kind of heavy lifting work that a student could knock out at a fairly fair rate, I would say.
Okay, well, yeah, thank you. We only have one wildlife health person for our entire state, and she is pretty busy on CWD. So we don't have even one person to kind of
Oh
have
my
the
goodness.
capacity. So
And you have a big state.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's a pretty big state. A lot
Yeah.
of species.
Well,
So-
I wonder who is your regional coordinator? It's Ann?
Yes, I think I wrote
Ann
down Ann.
Justice?
So
Ann Allen, right?
I will reach out.
Anne is the chair of the WAFWA Fish and Wildlife Health Committee, and so she's kind of filling in, representing region as a sort of representative regional coordinator while they hire someone permanent for that position. So I'm sure that she would be happy. I think she was on the call, so maybe I don't want to speak for her, but she's an awesome resource. If she can't help you herself, perhaps she can put you in touch with someone who can.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, everyone.
All right. Are there any other questions? Okay. Well, I would suggest, in light of the fact that we only have about 12 minutes left, that maybe this time around we forego the breakouts, but Mark and I can talk about, as he suggested, doing a follow-up perhaps at our next meeting. So again, thank you. I thought the presentations were phenomenal today and some great info.
Hey,
Mark, you want to?
Jason, yeah, since
sorry.
we do have a few minutes, I mean, I just wanted to get to one of the questions that we were going to do in the breakout groups. I mean, can anybody like tell us what barriers that haven't been discussed today, barriers to incorporating fish and wildlife health in your statewide action plan? And then we can see if we could help find some resources to overcome those barriers. Any barriers that weren't discussed today? Does anyone have any? Oh, there's Eileen. Yes, Eileen.
Thanks, Mark. I'm in South Dakota and I just looked it up. Like Montana, we do not have a vet school. So I think there are a lot of states that just do not have the specific resources that others do. And I thought Darby's presentation was really helpful in giving us specific ways of doing this. And I just wanted to compliment her I found that really relevant, because this is not a topic we have expertise in. I don't know who I would go to. So even if there are things that are broad brush recommendations for us, that's helpful. But I mean, the barrier is our usual barrier. We just don't have the expertise that a lot of other states might, or the staff to really dig into this kind of topic.
Thanks for that, Eileen. Great comment. Tricia?
Hi, Eileen. I am your regional coordinator, and I think that, like Ellen presented, we are a great resource. And the other thing I always wanted to say too is, and Dr. Ballard said this, is I think the swaps and everyone is actually doing a lot of this already in what they've done in their current plans. And so I think the idea of kind of highlighting those components would be the best tool going forward. Potentially not adding work, just saying this work falls under this category as well. And I'd be happy to work with you on looking at your plans and trying to kind of highlight some of those opportunities that Darby also pointed out. So those were some really great presentations today. And I think it's great to be bringing these ideas across the different MAFWA committees.
Thank you, Tricia. I appreciate that.
And I don't want to speak for, the agencies that I'm working with too much, but I think they would probably agree, like whatever we can share as far as our process, like, I'm happy to do so in as much as that's helpful to other states.
I think it would be a huge help, Julie, and, I'd be happy to disseminate anything that you have, to this group. Just really impressive what you're doing in Pennsylvania.
And I think to Tricia's point, a lot of the aspects of wildlife resiliency that Jen's presentation touched on, they are addressed already in the WAP. So our deficiency, if we were going to call it that from our previous WAP, was specifically focused on wildlife disease and disease-causing agents, not habitat fragmentation, not habitat loss, or resource availability, not climate change. So those are all intertwined, of course, but a lot of those are already addressed in the WAP. That's kind of what narrowed our focus. So I think, yeah, capitalizing on that and saying, hey, wildlife health isn't just about those disease-causing pathogens, but in fact, all those other elements, and we already have those incorporated into our WAP, is a pretty powerful thing to do.
Any other questions or comments?
I guess if there's no more, I'll ask Julie one more question about the literature search.
Mhm.
So I was just curious, so you guys are gonna do the literature search, and then I was just kind of curious, and I might have missed this because I stepped out for a second, like how you were planning to incorporate that into your SWAP, and if you're gonna do like some sort of ranking or just like have the literature information.
I think we're probably going to prioritize and do some ranking and synthesis of all that information, because I'm anticipating it'll be pretty bulky, the summary, and it'll need some refining and prioritization in collaboration with Game Commission and Fish and Boat, both by, species and threat, to condense it to a format that's most appropriate for the SWAP. But that's a great question, and we'll keep you posted on that process.
That'd be great. And I can, I'll send you the proposal we submitted. It's, I think 10 pages, but we've outlined a plan for the ranking. So yeah, it sounds like if we get funded, we might be doing a similar thing. And then I came from working with USGS and disease, so it's a particular interest of mine, but I obviously don't have the capacity to do it anymore. So yeah, I will send you our proposal just so you can see how we were hoping to do it.
That is awesome. And I can send you ours, which I described today, but also the survey information. And let's just keep in touch, because we could be kind of like an Atlantic side of things and you're more Western. And so maybe we can connect some dots there.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks.
Hey, Jason, you want to close us out?
I think I'll just say thanks again, everyone, for speaking, for everyone for joining us, and we will talk to you. Right now, we're planned for December 13th. Mark and I are talking about doing tentatively a roundup on some of the lessons learned and just have an open forum. So we could continue this discussion there if you like. And yeah, watch for a note from Mark. And really just wish everyone has a happy and healthy Thanksgiving.
Thank you, Jason and Mark.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thanks both.